Okay, good morning. We are going to talk about post-war art today. Um, so this is going to play a role in the later abstract things that you're going to be doing, or things that are a little bit less traditional than the things we've been doing so far. Um, Usually when I start this lecture, I like to ask the class, could you tell me who the most important artist of the 20th century is? Okay, since the 20th century is over, been over for a while now, we can sort of see it in its wholeness, and we can determine who the most influential artist of the 20th century, in fact, was. And by influential, that means art wouldn't be the same as it is right now if this artist didn't exist. Okay, so that's a pretty important thing. In like, you could imagine, what would have happened to the development of Western painting had linear perspective, for example, never been used in a painting. So that it's that kind of watershed sort of impact that we're talking about in terms of painting. Now, had I asked this question in the middle of the 20th century, in the 1950s, who is the most important artist of the 20th century, the answer would have undoubtedly been this artist. And this is Pablo Picasso. And this is an analytic cubist portrait of his dealer at the time, Ambrose Vollard. Now, the reason why an artist in the 50s would have said this is the most important artist is because painting changed after this. Painting changed after Cubism. We talk about the development of Western painting, and there are really, according to the critic Arthur C. Danto, there are two narratives of Western painting. There is the Vasarian narrative, which is Vasari, the art historian from the time of the Renaissance, where he is discussing what the development of painting and how it was progress was measured by better and better illusion of depth within a painting. Okay, and then as a counter to that, we have the Greenbergian narrative of Western painting, and that occurs at the time of modernism, which this painting was painted during that time. And during modernism, we see a turning away from trying to get across the illusion of depth and trying to make paintings more and more flat. Okay, so what Picasso was thinking about when he was developing Cubism, I believe, was he looked at representation at the time, and representation in painting to him, which he was well trained in. His father was an art teacher. His father was also an artist, and Picasso had become pretty adept at rendering in sort of a Rembrandt type of way illusionistic space by the time he was 15 years old. And he realized, because a painting like that, for example, First Communion, which was an early painting by Picasso, a painting like that would take several months to render, form in space in a believable way, when you can just do the same thing by pushing a button and taking a photograph. So Picasso understood that the future of painting didn't lie in representation of naturalistic space or form. Painting had to do what only painting could do. That was something that was sort of important to his way of thinking, because Picasso was very much aware that he wanted to be the most important artist painting. And so to be the most important artist painting, you had to be making the most important art. And the most important art had to be the most forward-looking, the most cutting edge. So that's, in fact, what he did. He set out to reinvent how a painter would handle space. And like I mentioned before, with analytic cubism, what you're dealing with is the rendering of an object or a landscape, still life, or a person in this case, from multiple viewpoints, and taking those multiple viewpoints and synthesizing them into one two-dimensional plane. Now, when you were in drawing one, you learned about linear perspective, and you learned that for linear perspective to work, you had to have one viewpoint, okay? One eye level. You couldn't have multiple viewpoints, multiple eye levels, or you would end up with something that would be a very difficult space to read in terms of naturalism, right? But Picasso is deliberately doing that, okay? So by doing that, you're sort of fracturing the space, okay, of that illusion of depth, and you are, excuse me, you are rendering that space shallow, okay? So that's what you see happening in Picasso. Now, Picasso is not, you know, contemporary painting. Picasso is of an era, the modernist era. The modernist era is over, okay? So a lot of times people talk about modern art and, you know, they don't like modern art. And what they're talking about is something that happened 100 years ago, basically. We're now in a postmodern era. And I think just for clarity's sake, I talk about, you know, post-war art and using that as a starting point. You really should know the history before post-war art, but definitely post-war art is something that you're going to want to be aware of, all right? Now, like I said, because of this reinvention of space, which Picasso wasn't the only one doing this, Georges Braque and him together were working on these ideas. And in the last lecture, I made reference to a painting by Mark Tansey that sort of illustrated the point that I was making. And he has another painting that illustrates that point. It showed, the painting shows Picasso and Georges Braque as the Wright brothers, right? At Kitty Hawk, discovering the airplane, okay? And so he's making that equivalency that it was in the same way that the airplane revolutionized travel, Braque and Picasso revolutionized painting, okay? So because of that, in the 50s, everybody was dealing with Picasso. Before the 50s in France, everybody was dealing with Picasso. Everybody was trying to wrap their heads around Cubism, okay? Much to the horror of art dealers, because Cubism was a tough sell for the public, okay? People didn't really like it, but artists saw it as something that was being, you know, certainly very revolutionary, okay? So this would have been a hard thing for this dealer to sell, but then again, he supported Picasso, and artists responding started all making this Cubist work in France. And by the time everybody in France is doing it, then Picasso stops doing it and starts doing something else because, you know, that's the way he is. But anyway, then it comes over to America, this idea of of how to handle space. So there are two main things that are going to inform American painting. And one of them is this, Cubist space. The other one is going to be surrealism, which we'll be talking about, okay? Okay. Now, if you ask somebody now that we're in the 21st century, who is the most important artist of the 20th century, then the answer has to be this artist, okay? So this artist and this type of work changed the way we think about art, okay? And it changed our relationship to art. Now, in the 50s, this artist was known, but he certainly wasn't seen as being somebody important, okay? But his fingerprints are on a lot of things in the development of painting, especially painting in America, even though he's not an American. Picasso never came to America. This artist did. This artist is Marcel Duchamp. And what this image is that you're looking at, this category of work, this is a ready-made. A ready-made is something that, just like the name implies, is already made. The artist didn't make it. The artist went and purchased it, okay? And so this is called Fountain, and it was displayed in 1917. He signed it R. Mutt, okay? It's a pseudonym, which again was a sort of an interesting strategy for an artist that you're going to see artists doing later. And what it is a urinal, okay? So a toilet that Duchamp purchased at a plumbing supply store and then put on top of a pedestal and called it a sculpture. So in the plumbing supply store, this object is simply a urinal. But when it's into the context of a gallery in an art show, just by that context alone, it becomes art, okay? So that idea is revolutionary. You can't imagine anything really that you go look at in MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art, and not see it through the lens of Duchamp. Other artists that people look at is having being very radical in their outlook. Maybe some of the pop artists. So a lot of times people say Andy Warhol would be the most important artist of the 20th century. Well, Warhol couldn't have existed without Duchamp. Warhol was influenced by Jasper Johns. Jasper Johns couldn't have existed without Marcel Duchamp. Jasper Johns himself credits Duchamp and the ideas in the Dada art movement, D-A-D-A, Dada. Those ideas were things that Jasper Johns sort of wrestled with and developed as sort of a way of getting out of abstract expressionism, okay? But Duchamp, when he makes this work, isn't even sure that, I think he might have thought it was a one-off and maybe a joke. They didn't even save the thing, okay? This urinal signed by him and exhibited in that context would be worth millions had they saved it, but they just threw it away. They just thought it was like, okay, well, we kind of get it. Now, there are copies of this that exist, and that's another strategy of Duchamp. He did multiples. And so that is something that you see, again, being used in contemporary art all the time. You could teach a whole class on Duchamp, all right, and the ways that he's influenced art since, not just with the ready-made, but also he's a precursor to installation art, okay? He's a precursor to conceptual art, certainly. He describes painting as being retrograde, even at this time. He starts off as a painter. He starts off doing, sort of cubistic paintings. In fact, one of his paintings is very famous in the history of American art because it was exhibited here notoriously. That painting is called Nude Descending a Staircase. But by the time he's doing this type of work, he's already turned his back on painting. He calls it retinal art. It's painting, that it's something that is, just to exist by looking at, and to him that is not interesting. He's more interested in the ideas behind it, okay? Now that's a revolutionary idea. Like the object itself becomes unimportant, okay? Again, a revolutionary idea, because when you think about the making of art, art's all about the object, right? So that's why Marcel Duchamp is the most important artist of the 20th century, because of how he's impacted everything that came after. And like I said, when this piece is exhibited, there's a period of time, a long period of time, from 1917 to 1967, where these ideas are just sort of like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. But by the 60s, mid 60s, early 60s, these ideas sort of explode. Okay. Now Duchamp is important for a couple of other reasons too. He's important because he did come to America, so he saw, I think, something in the United States that maybe other people from Europe didn't see. He didn't have the sort of European chauvinism that a lot of the other artists, like say André Breton had, where they looked down on Americans. He's more about, he saw America as being maybe a new, more exciting type of society when he came here in the 30s and the 40s. He's important for the development of collectors like Peggy Guggenheim. He advised her on what was good in both European and American painting. He helped Jackson Pollock install the very famous Peggy Guggenheim mural. Okay, so and he was part of that armory show that took place. That was the first time that Americans got to see European painting in America. So, like I said, he's a hugely important figure in the development of art, not just painting but art. So this artist is another Dada artist, and so we're still right now sort of in the beginnings of or laying the foundation for what's going to happen in post-war art. So this is still before the war. This is Kurt Schwitters. Kurt Schwitters is also a Dada artist. This is a collage. Now, what happens when, and you guys are going to be doing a collage assignment, and what I want you to look at in here is what's important about the choices he's making is really, it's based on composition, right? It's in color, shape, things like that. It isn't based on the actual image or the text that he's putting into the collage, okay? You can see, you can recognize, you know, some images. There's a face in there and there's text in here and in here, text in here. But it's more about composing with the cut up pieces of paper, and some of them he does have a little bit of paint on, and making an interesting composition with the collage elements. Now that's something that most of the time students that are attempting collage have a hard time getting their head around, because most of the time, I mean, students have generally had experience with collage. It's usually in elementary school or middle school that they make these collages, and it's all about, you know, like, I'm going to collage pictures of eyes. It's going to be just a bunch of eyes, you know, that they're thinking about what the picture is of, you know, what the motif is. They're not thinking about overall composition generally. And so when I get students making collages in my classes, in, you know, at the college level, a lot of times they end up looking like these middle school collages because they're not thinking of them in formal terms. They're not thinking of them in terms of the design principles that we talked about before: unity, variety, balance, emphasis, rhythm, okay? They're not thinking about those things. They're just thinking about what the picture is they're sticking down onto the surface, okay? That's usually what they're thinking about. Now, the Dada movement, of which Marcel Duchamp was part, okay, happened during World War I, actually. So it's funny how war relates to the development of painting, or the development of art a lot of times. The movement started in Switzerland, in Zurich, Switzerland, and the artists were of, you know, French and German, Swiss, Italian extraction, okay? So they were from all these places in Europe, but they're all congregated in Zurich, Switzerland during World War I. Now, why would that be? Well, Zurich in Switzerland is a neutral nation. It's not part of the war. So if you do not want to participate in the war and you're of drafting age, which these artists were, then you go someplace where you're not going to get drafted, you know? So Zurich was where they ended up. And you had this collection of artists from all over Europe, and what they were thinking about when they were making work was they were trying to make an anti-art. They were reacting against art because the way that they looked at art was being a way of sort of furthering the agenda of civilization, and civilization was corrupt. So therefore art had to be corrupt. And so you had to tear it all down and start from scratch. That was sort of the idea, the impetus behind it. I relate to it because, you know, for me, in my generation, it was punk rock was the thing that, you know, punk rock's idea was tear everything down, okay? music had become part of um, the dominant society, and particularly pop music, and it all had to be destroyed, and we had to start over again. That was sort of the impetus behind punk rock. And so similar kind of thing going on with the Dada artists. Now, Dada is going to morph into surrealism, okay? So a lot of the surrealist artists are going to first gravitate towards the Dada artists, because a lot of the surrealist artists were in France, and they were coming back from World War I, and they were disillusioned, hopeless, and they saw this type of work as being sort of a way forward. Certainly, the founder of surrealism, André Breton, was a writer, and when he came back from World War I, he definitely responded to the Dada work, and it sort of laid the foundation for the development of surrealism, which this is an example of surrealism. Now, it's this type of work, it's sort of misleading as far as the thing that the abstract expressionists, for example, are going to take from surrealism. This artist, I think, relates better to later art in the 60s and 70s. So this is René Magritte, and this is called The Treachery of Images. It's a favorite painting of mine, because there's certain things that I remember, like the first time I ever saw them or images of them, right? And then they changed my way of thinking about art. Okay, I mentioned before the Mark Rothko painting, but this painting, when I saw it, and then I read what the translation was, and the translation is, "This is not a pipe," and I'm like, what does that mean? It's obviously a pipe. I'm looking at this image thinking, what does it mean when you say this is not a pipe when it is a pipe? And then it dawned on me, of course it's not a pipe. It's an image of a pipe, okay? The image and the object themselves are not the same thing. One is a representation of the thing, right? So that's a sort of a radical idea that you're going to see in the 70s, conceptual artists really explore with this, and the way they do it is the same way that Magritte does it, with image and text. So the way that the work is, or the way the image is perceived versus how the idea of the text is perceived, those ideas are going to play a big role in conceptual painting. But as far as surrealism goes, it's things like this that are what the abstract expressionists are looking at. And they're also very interested in the surrealist idea of the unconscious, okay? So the unconscious becomes something that you hear abstract expressionists talking about all the time. Getting to that, getting to the state where you're not making conscious choices in composition. That's sort of the goal of the surrealist and the abstract expressionist. Duchamp did this too. So Duchamp had, and other surrealist artists had these ideas where you would make a composition by accident, like you would cut up pieces of paper and just drop them onto the surface of the paper, and wherever they landed, that was the composition, okay? So a way of taking the artist's choice and all those biases that you maybe learned in art school, getting away from that and hopefully getting into something new, okay? But this is Jean Moreau, and he is a Spanish artist. And it's funny that that some of the biggest developments happen in France by Spanish painters, okay? So Picasso was from Spain, Dali, who I don't think I'm going to show you an image in this slideshow of Dali, but he's from Spain as well, and Miro also. So the thing that the abstract expressionists take from Miro is this idea of an all-over composition. So there is no one area on here that your eye gravitates to. Your eye bounces around everywhere, which is a very unique way of composing. That's not something that people had done before this time. your eye is led to a particular place, generally in a painting, generally for the subject, you know. So we talk about emphasis here. The emphasis is in a variety of places. Now your eye might gravitate to something like this, where it is maybe the largest shape, where you've got this contrast of color and you know, with black, or your eye might gravitate towards that, where you can start to make out a face. So the other thing that Miro does in a lot of his work is he's got sort of this whimsical, sort of lighthearted way of humorous way of putting these shapes together and making them seem like shapes of living things, okay? A shape that seems like it's a living thing but is not recognizable is often referred to as being biomorphic. So biomorphic shape becomes very important in the development of American painting. Now, this is an American painting, but this is not really looking at the things that were going on in Europe so much as developing out of a social realist agenda. Okay, so you see a lot of artists in the United States pre-World War II that are making what they feel like is socially relevant painting. Painting for the masses, painting for workers, that kind of thing. So developing out of that. This is Edward Hopper. And why he's in this slideshow is because I use him as an example of talking about how you deal with content in work, okay? The meaning behind the work. Now, oftentimes students get fixated on the, you know, well, what is it? It's, you know, well, it's a coffee shop, right? But if you said, you know, and it's a coffee shop in a city, okay? And if you just said to somebody, I'm gonna make a painting about a coffee shop in a city, likely, unless they know this painting, they're not gonna think of this, right? So you have all different kinds of associations with coffee shops. So what's important with Hopper is the formal choices he uses. So the slide lectures on the design elements and the design principles, those are what we've referred to as the formal elements of a painting, okay? And the formal elements in this painting are what informs its meaning, particularly the use of space. Look how small these figures are in relation to the vast space, okay? So what that does is it establishes sort of an isolation, you know, an emptiness, a feeling of not being part of the world, you know, somehow being outside of it. Even though these people are sort of interacting to some degree, I mean, the man with the guy behind the counter, but it still seems very lonely and isolated. And again, that's because of these formal choices. Look at this choice, right? The choice of the format, which again, a lot of times students just take as, you know, a given, okay? And a lot of times it is. When I assign something, usually I'm giving you the dimensions that it has to be. Certainly, I've done that in the things you've done so far. But later, you're going to get to make that choice, and you need to think about. It's the first choice you make, really. You need to think about how you want the shape of the canvas to be, and what does that convey. And when we have a long horizontal like this, that generally conveys calmness, stability. It's usually not as active. And the other thing that he does to sort of calm this down is, even though we have, you know, some angles in here, they're very, very subtle angles. Now, what he did when he was making this painting is that he did a series of drawings trying to figure out what was going to be the optimal composition for this painting, right? So he has all different formats. So like what we do with the thumbnails, he did multiple thumbnails, but with his thumbnails, he was altering the dimensions, right, of the canvas. That's what he was thinking about, how big it was, or what the ratio of the height to the width was going to be. Another thing that provides stability is And this is where rhythm comes in, because there is a rhythm happening in here, but it's a very, very slow rhythm. It's a very calm rhythm. But if you look at the shape of the canvas and then how many times that shape gets repeated in the painting, okay, over and over again, it gets repeated in the painting, right? This dimension gets repeated again and again in these little units here. That is not accidental, okay? It's not just something that happens. So that was something that he planned as a way of reinforcing the stability, the calmness of this image, the quietness of the image. So it's the formal choices that, and he's got fairly muted color, even though there's a bright interior here. The brightness isn't really the thing that you're thinking about, right? And in a way, the brightness within here and the darkness out here has a way of making these figures seem even more isolated than they would be otherwise. So if you look at Edward Hopper's work, all of his paintings are that subject, not coffee shops, okay? That's a motif. All of his paintings are about this emptiness, okay? This sense that something is maybe going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. So you have these very sort of unsettling scenes, okay? Just by framing, just by color choices, just by scale and proportion choices, formal choices that create the content of the work, okay? And that's what painters do, all right? Here's an example of a surrealist artwork. This is by Merritt Oppenheim. And what's good about this, as far as for students to be thinking about, is how the material choices inform the work, okay? So Merritt Oppenheim is a woman, and she's the first person I in this slide lecture that I've shown that is a woman. And this is a very sort of feminine artwork, not just because it is, you know, a stereotypically feminine thing, a cup and saucer and spoon, but one of the main strategies of surrealism is taking things that don't go together and putting them together to create something new, okay? We talked about that with, you know, the design principles and how, like, somebody like Jeff Koons, for example, or Charles Ray, do weird things with scale and make something familiar unfamiliar, all right? So she's doing that with this cup and saucer. And when I have my students look at this work and I want them to think about, well, what does that mean? Okay. What is the content in this? Okay. Not simply that it's, well, that's weird. What's going on? What are the psychosexual connotations going on in this piece? And so when they think about that and sort of fumble around with, you know, what could it possibly mean? I tell them, imagine using this. Imagine filling that cup up with tea and then taking it to your lips and drinking the tea out of that cup lined with fur. What would that feel like? Okay. That idea is the content. Okay. That's what the work is about. So the sort of certainly sexual connotation, feminine connotations that we have with this, those are the things that make us enjoy what is happening in this piece. That's what it's about. Not simply that it's weird, okay, but the way it makes us feel. Now, a lot of times I get the feeling that people in general, I know this for a fact, people, but not just people, art students, people studying art have no clue what art is, okay? they like images maybe, but that's it. Okay. When they first are starting out, I know that was for me, that's what it was. I mean, I like to draw and I like to render things. And that was what I was my motivation when I got started. I never really thought about, art. In fact, I didn't really think of art as being a possibility. I didn't really even understand what it was. By the time I'd gone to college as an undergraduate, I had never been to an art museum in my life. It was not something, and my parents were both college educated people, but it was not something, and I grew up here in Los Angeles where there are art museums, but it's not something that, sort of your upper middle class people necessarily did. Okay. Art was always sort of an out there sort of activity. It was for other people. It wasn't really for everybody. Okay. And to some degree that's true because, in ways it is, in ways it's not. Art is available to everybody, but you have to be somewhat informed about what you're looking at for you to participate adequately. Okay. If a piece like this has to exist within context, and like we said with Duchamp, art depends on context. The reason it didn't before was that the context was all taken for granted. Everybody understood what art was about. Art was usually paintings about, either the classical antiquity or about Jesus or something like that. The story was understood. We understood what the meaning was behind the work, right? So that wasn't really something for people to explore. What people had to explore was more, subtle variations in the formal, right? That was kind of what was going on with the development of art, particularly painting, right? But now we have sort of a contextual meaning of painting where it's dependent upon the context that it's presented in and what it's referring to outside of itself. Those things become important. And if you have no foundation in what happened in art, in painting, when you look at something contemporary, you don't get it. You don't understand. Okay. So, and so it takes learning about it for you to sort of get the premises behind things. Okay. Now, what the tendency is for most people in my family, certainly, not my immediate family, but my family when I was growing up, the tendency for most people is, well, if I don't understand it, then I don't need to understand it. Stupid. Okay. Or you hear this a lot. Well, that's, when Marcel Duchamp puts a toilet in an art gallery on a pedestal, he's just making fun of you. Okay. It's a joke and he's just seeing what he can get away with. Okay. And so there's a certain outrageousness certainly involved in that Duchamp work, but that's not all of it. Okay. So it's a very sort of reactionary impulse that people have when they're confronted with something new. What I always tell people, the difference between art and not art, or art versus what Clement Greenberg talked about as being kitsch. Okay, kitsch is a German word, and kitsch, is talking about, pop music, Broadway shows, posters, advertisements, cartoons, those kinds of things that are part of the popular culture but aren't meant to challenge you in any way. They're meant to confirm what you already believe. Okay. And we'll probably talk about that a little bit more as we go on. So that's what kitsch does. Somebody like Thomas Kinkade, which everybody used to know when, 10 years ago, but a lot of people don't know who he is now, but he was very popular. He had galleries in the malls and things, and he was selling his horrible little paintings of cottages in the forest. Those little paintings, those are kitsch. Okay, so the reason they're not good is because they're sort of, I don't know, fifth generation impressionism and not even good impressionism, and they all tell the same sort of bullshit story that appeals to oddly, and don't take offense if this is you, Republicans and born again Christians. Okay, and and why that appeals to them is because it sells them an idea that really never existed of this idealized past. Okay, the same thing that Trump campaigned on. Okay, this idealized past that never really existed, but people somehow missed. Okay, so obviously Trump lives in a palace of kitsch. Okay, before he was in the White House. I'm not going to say that about the White House necessarily, but he's probably redecorated it so that it is so. But Trump Tower with all the gold furnishings and all that, that is kitsch. Okay, but fine art challenges your assumptions. It presents something to you that you've never seen before, or something that you've seen but gives it to you in a different way and makes you think about that thing in a different way. Okay, a way you never thought about before. It makes you think something new or feel something new, and that's what makes it art. Okay, so think about that when we're making things, because in this class we are going to be trying to be making art in the second half of it anyway. Right now we're just trying to master the skills of representation, but ultimately we're going to utilize those or not to make art. Okay, which is why this class is sort of a class that usually is just for art majors, people that are going to go on and take more art classes, or why this class is the class that you get nominated into the mentor program, for example, from either 20B or Art 31 or 32, the upper division classes, because we feel like at this point that we can kind of see what you're doing and what you're thinking about and whether or not you're a worthy candidate to go on. Okay. Even if you're not going to be an artist, even if you want to be an illustrator or an animator, which I get the feeling a lot of you are in that category, even if you want to be that, if you can think of things in the way that an artist thinks about things, you will be successful in that field. If you just represent all the crap that you were given and just keep making that crap, then you won't be. Okay, so the people that are innovators in that field are people that are doing something new, and the people that are just the people are not. Okay, why anybody would want to get involved in animation in that level is beyond me. Okay, God bless you if that's something you want to do. To me, it seems like the most repetitive, boring thing in the world, but whatever. Hopefully that you're trying to then break out of that ultimately. Okay, now we have our first American artist, and this is probably happening during World War II, or maybe right before. And there's a lot of things that are factors in the development of this work. Okay, now this is the beginnings of abstract expressionism, and this artist is hugely important as sort of a founding father to abstract expressionism. This is Arshile Gorky. Gorky, forgive me, I don't remember his original name. Gorky is a name that he gave himself because when he came to America, he is an Armenian American. When he came to America, he felt like being an Armenian, I guess, wasn't special enough. So he would tell people that he was, Arshile Gorky, this exiled Russian prince. Okay, so he took a Russian name. Developing this sort of mythology about himself. And what he did that was unique was that he was aware of what was going on in European painting, and he took two art movements that didn't really go together, surrealism and Cubism, and tried to fuse those two things together to make something new. Okay. So that was why he's so important. Now, what happens in New York is that you've got this condensation of artists that are all here in this one little area. Okay. And before this period in time, really, if you told people you were an artist, people would just assume that that meant you were a bum, that you were somebody who didn't really want to work. And, you know, because nobody really knew what artists were in the United States, right? So, you know, they would know what a commercial artist was, but other than that, they didn't, you know, we didn't really have this tradition of fine art painting. So to be that, you sort of were an outsider in New York. And Gorky, you know, in about, I don't know, about the late 30s maybe, was wandering around New York one night, and he sits down on a bench, and he's smoking a cigarette. All the abstract expressionists were smokers. Pretty much everybody in society was at that time. And a guy comes and sits next to him, and the guy looks down at his feet and sees he's got paint spatters on his shoes, and the guy has paint spatters on his own shoes. So he says to Gorky, "So what do you do?" And Gorky said, "I'm a painter. I'm an artist. I'm a painter." And this guy says, "Well, I am too." And so Gorky says, "Well, you know, why don't you come to my studio?" Okay. Now that artist was this artist. That was Willem de Kooning. Okay, Willem de Kooning, who becomes really well known as one of the great abstract expressionist painters, right? And Willem de Kooning had been schooled formally in art schools, you know. So he had, you know, gotten work as a commercial illustrator and done, you know, posters and things like that for advertisements. So he was really well schooled in representation and painting. But he was tempting, you know, this is a little bit later, but he was trying to come to terms with surrealism, certainly, in the work that he was making at the time that he meets Gorky. And Gorky had never gone to art school. So the two of them go to Gorky's studio, and when de Kooning sees Gorky's work, he's shocked. He's taken aback, because this person who'd never gone to art school was already light years ahead of him in the development of a new sort of vocabulary of painting, which was something that de Kooning was looking for too. In fact, all of the abstract expressionists had this idea that they needed to take painting to that next level, okay? To that, you know, to create a real avant-garde sort of art. All of them thought that. So we start off with just de Kooning and Gorky, but then that group grows and grows and grows. And these guys actually did, in the same way that the French did. The French would get, you know, together, and they would meet in cafes or bars and talk about, you know, what was important in art and society and things like that. So the abstract expressionists started to do that too. They started actually meeting in bars. They went to the Cedar Tavern, you know, in New York, or they even rented a space, sort of a clubhouse, where they would all get together and they would meet and they would argue about what painting was, what it needed to be, what it had to be. And most of them came to the consensus that it had to be completely non-representational, completely abstract, okay? No reference to anything outside of itself. Now with Gorky, he's taking certainly a lot from surrealism. The other thing that helps with the development of painting in America is the Depression, okay? When the Depression happens, we have something called the WPA, the Works Project Administration. And what that was an idea that the government had to get us out of the Depression, all right? And so what they said was, you know, we need to invest in infrastructure, in building. And when we do that, you know, we start building roads and highways and dams, things like that, government buildings. In fact, a lot of our infrastructure now was built then. Okay, so the highways originated in the 30s, the dams originated in the 30s, all that stuff as they tried to get America back to work. And at one of these meetings, somebody says, well, what about the artists? We need to get the artists back to work. And thankfully, nobody at the meeting said, who cares about the artists? The artists weren't working before the Depression. Why should they be working now? You know, they didn't have that attitude because, you know, it was a Democratic administration. But they said, yeah, the artists, we need to get the artists back to work. And so they created two divisions for artists, the easel painting division and the mural painting division. So they felt like, you know, we're going to build all these government buildings, post offices and things like that. And so we're going to need to have, you know, artwork. Maybe for a post office, we have a nice mural, or a school, we all have a mural. And maybe for, you know, a government office, we're going to need paintings inside the offices. So we'll have these artists make things for these buildings. And all you had to do as an artist in New York was submit a portfolio, and then you had a paycheck, okay? Now, this was revolutionary. Artists had never been paid for their work before, are suddenly getting a steady paycheck. And so that allowed them to then work on their own work as well and develop what they were doing, okay? Now, some of their work would then get, you know, subsumed into what they were doing for the government, but certainly that was an important aspect of it. And the other important aspect, in just the same way that World War I influenced the development of Dada and Surrealism, World War II caused Europe to come to us. So we had an influx of European painters coming to the United States, artists. André Breton, the founder of Surrealism, comes to the United States. Dali comes to the United States. All these people, Duchamp's in the United States. All these people are in the United States. And so these Americans now are getting to see real artists, and real artists with the attitude that, you know, of course we are relevant to society, and of course we're important. That becomes really important to the way that these Americans look at themselves, okay? Now, André Breton, when he comes to the United States, he gets a job working for Radio Free Europe, and he's doing, you know, radio broadcasts and things to occupied France. And when he came here, he had the attitude that, you know, I'm in America now, but, you know, I'm not going to learn English just because I'm in America. I speak French. If you are educated, you speak French. So, and if you're not educated, I don't want to talk to you. So he had this very sort of chauvinistic attitude about his status as a European artist, right? And he also understood the primacy of surrealism. He was the godfather of surrealism. So surrealism to him was art. The two things were the same, okay? And so the surrealists would allow some of these Americans to come to some of their little surrealist meetings, okay? And what André Breton said about Arshil Gorky was that Gorky is the only one who gets it. He's the only one who understands what we're trying to do. These other Americans, they're too stupid. But Gorky gets it, right? And so Gorky was sort of accepted as, you know, being sort of an American surrealist in a lot of ways, while he is, you know, taking these things and making something new. You can see a direct connection, I think, from Gorky or from Miro to Gorky, okay? The two of them are very similar in how they deal with composition, right? With an all-over composition, sort of that line work that you saw in Miro and those sort of biomorphic shapes, you certainly see in Gorky, okay? And so a lot of the abstract expressionists are going to take what Gorky's doing and they're going to start to develop that, okay? Now, Gorky, the reason Gorky is such a tragic figure, really, is because the abstract expressionists all have a development where what they start with is a lot like what's going on in European painting. So it's just sort of a pastiche or a copy of what they're doing in Europe. And this you could make that argument that that's what's going on in here, that it's really just sort of a rehash of Miro, even though maybe it's a little bit more painterly than Miro. So that's one aspect of it. The thing that you get to see though with these other artists is that they then grow out of that. So if you go to the MoCA website, some of you may have gone to the MoCA website because I put up that painting by Mark Rothko. You can see his early work compared to what he ended up doing. And his early work didn't look too different from what you're looking at right now, okay? A lot of the abstract expressionist early work kind of looks like this, okay? So that's how important, you know, sort of Miro is. You see this sort of, this line work that you see in Miro's painting and these biomorphic shapes, you see that repeated a lot in a lot of the early American abstract expressionist work. But all those artists then managed to grow from that, develop that, make something unique to them. Whereas Gorky didn't get to live that long. Gorky was spending a lot of time with the surrealists and going to these surrealist meetings. And Gorky would bring his wife to these meetings. And Gorky befriended a lot of the surrealists. He made really good friends with the Chilean surrealist Mata. And as their friendship developed, Mata developed a friendship with Gorky's wife. And that friendship developed even more. And pretty soon, you know, Mata is having an affair with Gorky's wife. Gorky finds out about the affair at the same time that Gorky finds out that he has stomach cancer. And so Gorky kills himself, he hangs himself, which you're gonna see that sort of subplot to a lot of these abstract expressionist painters. A lot of the abstract expressionists are depressed. But anyway, so he kills himself. And so what in the development of painting, you know, a timely death can be a good career move. It can sort of enhance your reputation. You can think about a lot of people in popular culture where that happens, you know, like Kurt Cobain. Probably Kurt Cobain and Nirvana wouldn't be as seemingly important as they are had Kurt Cobain not, you know, killed himself, or had, you know, or the Doors, you know, with Jim Morrison, you know, dying so tragically young, all that stuff. So like I said, it could be a good career move, but if you do it too soon, then sometimes it can, you know, obviously affect your career in a negative way, or certainly affect your development. Okay, so here is an example of somebody that maybe if he had lived a little bit longer, could have then moved beyond this. But what he did do was set this foundation for then everybody else in Western painting to sort of build off of. So Willem de Kooning. Willem de Kooning, having met Gorky, then starts to adopt some of these biomorphic shapes, certainly this sort of line work that you see, which is a little bit freer than what was going on and maybe more emphatic than what was going on in the Gorky. Certainly this cubistic space that we looked at in the Picasso is happening in here, this sort of shallow cubistic space. And it's completely non-representational, whereas you don't recognize anything going on in here. You can't really make anything out as referring to something outside of itself, which is the thing that the abstract expressionists moved beyond European painting, because most of the European painting, or the European modern masters, all of them stuck with representation. Matisse, Picasso, those people are all dealing with nature first and then converting that into, you know, abstraction, but still you would see that starting point, the recognizable objects in there. Now, de Kooning is going to have a very nice long career and paint up until the 80s, while he's in his 80s. He came to the United States from Holland. He actually stowed away on a ship, came to the United States because he felt like the United States, he'd seen it, you know, representations of it in movies, and he felt like there was this this vast space in the United States, this a different kind of light in the United States that that you didn't have in Europe, and so that's why he had to come here. And like we mentioned before, Gorky was born in Armenia, so you have these, the part of this immigrant experience coming into the United States and informing what's happening with our painting. Okay, this is a completely non-representational painting, but in the 50s, de Kooning is going to do something really radical, and he's going to flip back to representation, and with his Woman series. So with Woman 1, he will start using representation again. And then the rest of his career is sort of this fusion of representation, form and space, and abstraction, okay, to some degree or another. But what you can see in here certainly is the painterly quality of it, where the substance of the paint becomes really important. That's an aspect of modernism where you're calling attention to the media itself, so that if you look at Renaissance painting, when you're looking at a Renaissance painting, you're not supposed to be aware that that's paint on a piece of fabric, right? That's not something you're supposed to be thinking about. But with modernist work, oftentimes it is something you're thinking about, and that's by design. If you think about, what it's like to read modernist literature, the idea that you're reading something, that the author might address you, and instead of you feeling like you are, thinking this story or something, the regular narrative structure, like say by a writer like James Joyce, the narrative structure becomes sort of a framework for all these other things that are going on. And you can't read Joyce without really being aware that you are reading. Okay, I mean, it becomes foregrounded in a lot of ways, as it does in, say, modernist cinema, where you've got, Russian cinema, where you have the use of montage and editing, where you become very aware of the editing. That is something that, would have been a flaw in a Hollywood film, that if you're like obviously aware of what's going on with the editing or the music or something like that, then that would have been seen as a way of taking you out of the story. And so with the Europeans, Russians in particular, they were trying to make you think about, well, no, we want you to see that you are actually watching a film. We want you to be thinking about this in terms of that, in terms of the fact that the media itself is important. Or in, say, a play by Brecht, where the actors will actually go into the audience, will actually, address people in the audience directly. Okay, again, taking you out of the experience of just seeing the play, witnessing the play, and making you a participant. It makes you then aware that you are in this dramatic situation, right? So foregrounding the media becomes really, really important in the development of Western painting in the modernist era and then the postmodernist era. This is Franz Kline, and Franz Kline meets de Kooning. And when Franz Kline meets de Kooning, Franz Kline is painting like, clown paintings, that kind of thing, Harlequins, things that, motifs that he had got from, Picasso probably. And then after meeting de Kooning, he starts, in fact, a lot of the abstract expressionists go through a black and white period. I think that's kind of important. And when you think about, the development of painting, a lot of times color gets in the way of what you're trying to do. In fact, Franz Kline did make some color paintings, but they were never as successful as his black and white paintings. Now, what makes Franz Kline so interesting is that you've got, these things that read maybe as line, right? But there's certainly movement, okay? And the primacy of rhythm and movement in Kline's work is really evident, okay? Certainly completely non-representational. Kline was all about that calligraphic mark. Kline would take a telephone book. So for you young people that don't know what a telephone book is, it's this big, thick book that used to be in every single telephone booth. And you don't know what those are either. But he would take these big phone books, yellow pages, and he would open it up to the first page, and he'd get a bottle of ink and a Sumi ink brush, and he would dip it in the ink, and he would make these strokes and go to the next page, fill up the whole book with these sort of marks. And then he would tear the pages out and isolate them or combine them in ways of trying to come up with some of these compositions. Okay, so that's what's going on in them. And a cursory reading of this is that it's just black lines on a white ground, when it actually isn't. He's painting in the white as well. You can kind of see the brushiness in here. Certainly he's the idea of the primacy of the media, right? So you can see the drips. The drips, again, would have been seen as a flaw in painting up until now, whereas here it's just a way of foregrounding the media. So it becomes really important, not just black drips, but white drips, okay? So these are things that are gonna be really, really important for painting as it progresses. Then we talked about Pollock and Pollock's importance. Now, Pollock was somebody that when someone told him, I think it was actually, drawing a blank on his name, Hans Hofmann. So he met Hans Hofmann, and Hans Hofmann, who was a teacher, he wasn't Pollock's teacher, but Hans Hofmann told him, well, you really should draw and paint from nature. And Pollock's answer to that was, I am nature. So what Pollock is saying is, because he is this natural thing, he is, the marks that he's making are then going to represent nature, all right? In the lecture about the design principles, I mentioned that he was very influenced by Picasso, and then I didn't mention his teacher. I alluded to it, but his teacher, when he came to New York, was Thomas Hart Benton, and which was an unusual choice for an art teacher. Thomas Hart Benton was sort of an American regionalist, and he would do, these paintings of, the expanding West, and, Native Americans and cowboys and, railroads being built and stuff like that. He was looked at, even in the 30s, by, young art students as being sort of passé. Pollock arrives in New York City. He was born in Cody, Wyoming. His family was moving around a lot, and he spent time in Los Angeles. He actually went to Manual Arts High School in Los Angeles. He was friends with somebody who's going to become a later abstract expressionist, Philip Goldstein, who then becomes Philip Guston. So he was, and his brothers were all artists. He had 4 brothers. I think there were 5 boys. And and I think all of them were artists. In fact, one of them, or a couple of them, had gone on to New York in advance of Pollock. And the idea, so he was like, oh, well, if they can do it, I can do it. They were more about, maybe being illustrators or something like that. They weren't really, so keen on maybe being fine artists. So Pollock just jumps on a freight train and goes from Los Angeles all the way to New York. Because you can't really be an artist in LA at that time. You had to go to New York. And he enrolls in the New York, what was the school? I don't remember. The Cooper Union, maybe, okay? But he enrolls in the art school, and he signs up to take classes with Benton. Now Benton, the thing about Benton is that he's got this very sinuous, muscular sort of way of drawing. He abstracts his figures, stylizes his figures in a very unique way. And I think that aspect, maybe subconsciously, was something that Pollock sort of took in development of these drip paintings. Now, Pollock does not start off with the drip paintings. Pollock is making these sort of pastiches that are sort of Picasso-esque, but certainly they're symbolic, and they are representational. And Pollock was one of the artists that was included in a show, a juried show put on by Peggy Guggenheim, And Peggy Guggenheim said, or the idea was that they were trying to discover some of these new American artists. So they got some judges. Marcel Duchamp was one of them, and Mondrian was another one. And I'm forgetting who the third one was. And these three judges were going to look at this American painting, and they were going to, pick out what was the most worthwhile, right? So Mondrian gets to the gallery before anybody else. He walks in, and all the art is just sort of laying around on the floor, propped up against the wall, and he's going and looking at them. And he pauses and he looks for a long time at a work by Jackson Pollock, not a drip painting, but one of his representational paintings. And Peggy Guggenheim comes up behind him and says, "Oh yes, oh God, isn't it horrible?" And Mondrian says, "No, I don't think so. I think there's something in this." And so then, the next judge arrives, and Peggy Guggenheim goes and runs and gets that judge and says, come and look at this great new discovery we've made, And that's sort of the beginning of Pollock's career, right? And so Peggy Guggenheim then commissions a mural for him to do for her penthouse. And so sort of his career starts to take off, okay? Now, Jackson Pollock is a raging alcoholic. He's such a bad alcoholic that he gets classified as 4F during World War II, so that he can't be drafted because he's too unstable. And he's actually spent, de Kooning as well, spent some time actually being institutionalized for alcoholism. And so he was the kind of drunk that would, drink all night, and they would have to go out looking for him in the morning, and they'd find him passed out in the gutter, that kind of drunk, okay? Fortunately for him, and maybe unfortunately for her, Jackson Pollock meets Lee Krasner, another artist. They're in a show together, and she knew all the artists that were in the show, but she didn't know him, so she went to his studio to introduce herself. And immediately, in walking into his studio, she realizes that this guy is way ahead of her in the development of his work. And she, at that point in time, maybe sort of a 50s attitude, decides she is going to put her career on hold and do everything she can to further his career, okay? And one of the most important things that she realizes is this guy is going to die if he stays in New York, because he can't get away from all of these bad influences on him. And so she takes him, and they move upstate, and they get a little farmhouse with a little barn, and they make that into Jackson Pollock's studio, and they try to dry him out, try to get him to quit drinking. And to some degree, he's successful. In other degrees, he's not. I mean, it's a lifelong thing, addiction. And he was on and off the wagon constantly. But for a period of time, he's sober in New York, in upstate New York, in this little farmhouse studio. And that's when he has this great breakthrough, okay, the drip paintings, and really sort of develops the possibilities of the way he looked at it was drawing in space. So he would walk all the way around the perimeter of the canvas. He'd have the canvas stretched out on the floor, be walking around it with cans of paint and sticks or dried up brushes and things, dipping the paint and throwing the paint, but actually not just throwing it, but drawing, letting the paint float in the air and seeing the little movements he was making in the air as they would fall then down on the canvas. That was sort of the development of the work. And then once he had made the work, then he would decide on how it was to be cropped and then stretch it over the frame, and then that would be the painting. Now, the other thing that's really important about his development is that Lee Krasner had gone to Hans Hofmann's school and was, as a lot of artists had done, and what Hans Hofmann was teaching was basically this European way of looking at, pictorial space. And he talked about, the push and the pull of shapes and colors and depth. Okay. And those were the things that he was sort of espousing in his classes. And so she was well versed in that. And fortunately for Pollock, we had a time where Clement Greenberg, who was a literature critic, he was talked about literature, not about art, but was getting more and more interested in contemporary painting, and particularly this new American painting that was happening. So Clement Greenberg would come and visit the Pollocks, and they were married at this point, and sit down in the kitchen with Lee Krasner, and Lee Krasner basically educated Clement Greenberg in art theory. Okay, so the theories behind what was going on in Pollock's work, and really all contemporary painting in New York at that time. And so Clement Greenberg then starts writing about art using the theories that he's picked up from Lee Krasner, who was getting it from Hans Hofmann. All right. Now, Pollock himself didn't study with Hofmann, didn't care about Hofmann. In fact, he was quite hostile towards Hofmann. But he did benefit from Clement Greenberg's championing him. And Clement Greenberg wrote a pretty important article about calling Jackson Pollock the most important artist in America living. Okay, so when you write an article like that gets picked up. You know, he was writing it for the Partisan Review or something. It was not something. It was an intellectual journal. It was not your your everyday newspaper. But it gets picked up by mainstream media, and so Life magazine actually sends out a reporter and a photographer to see Pollock's work and to interview him, and put a little story in Life magazine. We don't really have, I don't think, the equivalent anymore of Life magazine. Life magazine was something that everybody had. I mean, it was something most everybody subscribed to it. It would come, I don't know how often it would come, if it would come once a week or what, but it would sit on your coffee table. It was full of a lot of pictures and, and little snippets of articles. And so he gets, they write a kind of mocking article about him in Life magazine. There's a picture of him in his, Levi jacket with a cigarette dangling out of his mouth, looking like James Dean or somebody. And so we're talking about the 50s right now, or 40s, the late 40s, early 50s. And he's got his back up against the wall with the cigarette dangling out of his mouth. And it says, "Is this the most important artist in America?" And so that was the article. And that article, even though it was kind of making fun of him a little bit, it actually got collectors interested in his work. And so what happens is you now start to see collectors visiting the galleries that are showing abstract expressionist painting. Before this time, abstract expressionist painters are showing abstract expressionist paintings to other abstract expressionists. It's not really, it's sort of an insular club. It isn't something that everybody is, joining in on. And so once we start to see collectors come and start to buy the work, then abstract expressionism starts to kind of take off. Willem de Kooning is quoted as saying, well, the significance of Pollock was that he broke the ice. He was the guy that then everybody could see, oh, there's this new form of art and it's happening in New York and we want it. Okay, so that was important. You're going to see the way that the artists developed at this time. This took a fair amount of time for these guys. So most of them, their first shows are in their 40s, some of them in their 50s when they're having their first shows. And that's just because there wasn't really the infrastructure at the time. Later in the 60s, you're going to see artists that are, getting successful right away, right out of grad school, and that's kind of the model now. That, if you want to be a fine artist, you sort of have to go to graduate school and then you go on to, a major city and then you start your practice. But in these days, it was a little bit more organic as to how that developed. And here, this is a painting by Hans Hofmann. So with Hans Hofmann, he didn't show these right away. It wasn't until the late 50s that he started showing, even though he was making work, obviously, before the abstract expressionists. So a lot of his theories, this idea of, how do these colors work? How do they exist in space? when you've got something like that, where you've got this blue and this red right next to each other, how those two colors vibrate, how they react to each other, really impacts how you're perceiving the spatial relationship of these shapes, right? So that is real important to what Hofmann is doing. Hofmann really sort of educates a whole generation of painters in New York. And so, and not just that, but then a lot of those people will then go on to careers and then maybe get hired in universities and then, you know, go throughout the country to these, you know, universities like, let's say, Iowa, and then, you know, teach art to these undergrads, and they'll all be giving them Hofmann's theories, so that these undergrads then get Hofmann's theories. And even though they never studied with Hofmann, they are sort of, they have his DNA in them. Okay, so that's why he is significant. And then this is a painting that you saw, a painting a lot like this, if it wasn't this exact painting, on the first day, right? That I put this painting up and everybody panicked because they thought it was a black slide. And this is Rothko. Now, I mentioned before the idea of, you know, death is a good career move. With Pollock dies tragically in a car crash. And so I think that helps with his, you know, his myth, you know, the live fast, die young kind of thing. And then Mark Rothko, he does get quite successful, and then does kill himself. He sort of opened his arteries and bled to death. And but he did it after, you know, after he had achieved the success, after he had developed his painting from those, you know, sort of Gorky foundations into what you see here, this sort of contemplative, spiritual type of abstraction. Okay, and I talked about that in my little introduction, but for me, this idea that you could have this sort of emotional reaction to an artwork when there was so little going on in it, right? It's just rectangles inside of a larger rectangle. That to me was magic, right? And so the idea, though, when you see this work just reproduced like this in a slide, it doesn't really read. One of the things that's important to abstract expressionism is the use of scale, where they were making really large paintings. Pollock was part of the mural division in the WPA, so he got to see work for the, you know, in a very large scale, and that made him start to think about, oh, I could make work in a large scale as well. De Kooning starts working really big. A lot of them start working big because they are getting studio space inside of, you know, factory buildings, old, you know, abandoned factories that have a lot of space in them. And so when you've got a big space, then, you know, it encourages you to make big work. Where most of the French painting that was leading to abstract expressionism, all the French studios were like little apartment buildings, right? So they had little spaces and they were making little easel-sized paintings. So, you know, a painting like this could be 15 feet high, right? When you're dealing with scale, your perception of the work becomes completely different, and you can almost become subsumed by the space of this large surface. This artist I mentioned when talking about Jackson Pollock. So this is Philip Guston. This is Philip Guston's early work. This is Philip Guston's later work. Philip Guston in the 80s, when I was going to grad school, was kind of talked about, and this is the kind of work he was doing, was talked about as being sort of the painter's painter. And we'll talk about that piece in a minute. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. But this stuff, this is what he was doing when he came to New York. Now, like I said, Philip Goldstein knew Jackson Pollock in high school. The two of them were in the art club in high school, at Manual Arts High School. And Philip Goldstein was always the artist, the school artist. He was the one everybody looked up to. I'm sure Pollock looked up to him. right? And they thought, well, if I could just do what Goldstein does, and he was doing sort of surrealist type drawings of hooded figures and sort of social realist type work, influenced by, say, somebody like De Chirico. So that's what, you know, his little followers sort of were looking at in Manual Arts High School. But it's Manual Arts High School, right? So it's not really going to, you're not going to change the world from Los Angeles. So when Pollock goes to New York and gets the success, Goldstein's thinking, well, hell, if he can do it, I definitely can do it because I'm better than him. And so he does. He goes to New York and he starts painting these very polite sort of abstract expressionist paintings. And that's kind of what they are. They're polite. They're very sort of European looking. They're based on a sort of Mondrian grid structure. They have an almost, you know, sort of impressionistic, sort of shimmery pastel-like quality to them. They're just, you know, they're nice. And so nice wasn't really going to cut it, because you can see with abstract expressionism, a lot of those people were making this really sort of in your face, you know, challenging type of work. And this is like a way of maybe making it a little bit more palatable. Like, well, you can understand it now because it's sort of got this French coloration and French mark making and French structure to it, right? So it's a way of making it, you know, more useful to the masses, maybe, or just certainly more, you know, in the same way that Pat Boone records Tutti Frutti by, you know, Little Richard. It's a way to make people sort of accept something that seems threatening. Okay, so that was sort of the rap against him when he was an artist in the 50s. And had he just kept doing this, you know, I don't think anybody would care about Guston at all. It's when he gets to this that people take notice. There was just a great show at Hauser and Wirth of drawings from this era. And so what's going on in these paintings? First of all, my own experience with Guston, the first time I saw one of these later Guston paintings, it's one of those life-changing moments, because I saw that painting and I don't remember the context, but I do remember when I saw it, it was before I'd ever seen a reproduction of any of these. And it must have been some type of survey show. And I saw it and I thought, that is the ugliest painting I have ever seen in my life. And so when that, I mean, that's something, right? So the ugliest, you have to think about, well, why? Why is it ugly? What is the thinking behind that? Forced me to sort of investigate a little bit. So what Guston is doing is he's taking some of that surrealist imagery that he was doing when he was in high school, and he's representing it in a more cartoony, sort of personal way. And so these things have a kind of nightmarish quality to them, right? So you've got this thing which looks like it can be a profile of a face, but it also looks like it could be, you know, testicles. So there's this psychological component to it. In fact, the drawing show that I mentioned, he's doing a lot of these caricatures of Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon has got this great face for caricature. It was almost made for it. And he transforms Nixon's face into, you know, a penis and testicles in a lot of them. I mean, it has that direct reference to them. And he, again, having a very sort of scary, nightmarish quality, but also funny. I mean, a lot of them are funny. He's got, a lot of his paintings are like these hooded figures that look like Klansmen, you know, driving around and together in convertible, but they don't look threatening. They look like clowns. Okay, so it's this weird amalgamation of the unconscious and humor, abstraction and representation, surrealism and realism, these things that he's fusing together that are making these really sort of compelling, interesting works. Now, would I want to hang it on my wall? Yeah, I probably would, but not everybody does. Okay, so it's that challenging. Sometimes work is so challenging that it's really even hard to look at. One of the things you might notice, though, is the coloration is very similar. He seems to want to use this sort of red-blue thing happening in a lot of these abstract paintings, and that the emphasis on pinks and reds and blues in a lot of these paintings is evident. So that's another thing that's sort of interesting. But like I said, he was just so painterly that a lot of people sort of responded to that in the 80s. And the 80s was also a time where you had this sort of this neo-expressionist movement going on. So painterly painting was something that a lot of people were thinking about. And this is another slide that, you know, I show this to students and they freak out. This is Ad Reinhardt, and this is a black painting. And so the black paintings are 5 feet by 5 feet, and it's maybe difficult to tell, but he's got black, but he's giving these little additions to the black. So maybe have a little bit of blue or a little bit of red in the black, and you can see these shapes start to emerge. So these squares within the square. So you have 9 squares within the larger square. And when you first encounter the painting, what happens is you see it, and you see it first as a black square, and then you start to make out this shape. And what generally happens is you get this cross shape that sort of emerges from the black, okay? Now, Ad Reinhardt was part of the abstract expressionist school. You look at this painting and you think, well, it doesn't look very expressive, okay? All the other artists I showed you, with the exception perhaps of Rothko, you can see the sort of expressive component to it, certainly the abstract component to it. But this seems like, you know, sort of geometric abstraction, but it doesn't seem very expressive at all. But what Ad Reinhardt was thinking about were some of the things that the abstract expressionists were talking about, and he felt like they weren't doing. They were saying it, but they weren't doing it. And he said that, you know, you can't make something that is completely non-representational, but yet be dependent upon the vocabulary of representational painting. So he wrote a sort of a manifesto called Art as Art, okay? And he said that art is what art is, and art is not what art is not. And he said, art is not color. Art is not brushstroke. Art is not perspective. Art is not line. All these things, a series of negations, really, all the things that art is not. And what he felt like was, if you were going to get away from, you know, content and imagery, the only way to do it is if everybody painted the same painting. And then that way you would dispense with the idea of representation, and the representation, say, of inner states, which is kind of what the abstract expressionists were doing. And so he said that if everybody's going to paint the same painting, then what everybody should paint is a 5 foot by 5 foot black painting. And then once we do that, once every artist is painting that painting, only then do we get rid of content, okay? Now, of course, that is a very sort of a dead end, right? You can't really, once you hit that, that's sort of the last painting, right? So, and maybe Reinhardt thinks that he's made the last painting, and now painting can't exist after he's made this last painting, okay? Thankfully, you know, painting does, as you will see, continue. But again, a very sort of radical idea. Now, he's going to become very influential to the conceptual artists for a very important reason. For the one thing that he leaves out when he's talking about art is what art is and art is not what art is not, right? He never says in that manifesto, art is not painting, okay? He never says it. And the conceptual artists are going to make that statement. Art doesn't even have to be painting, okay? So you can think about, well, then what, you know, where's the art if there is no painting or if there is no object, okay? And that's what a lot of artists have been doing since that time, since the 70s, coming to terms with that idea. And then this is Barnett Newman. Don't remember which painting this is. It could be Joshua. I'm not 100% sure. But with with Barnett Newman, what he's doing, and again, he's still an abstract expressionist school, but he is, it doesn't look all that expressive. His big sort of innovation were these things. I want to say it's a line, right? Um, but he would say that he doesn't want you to call them stripes. Okay, they're not stripes. He calls them zips. And so he describes what the sort of the development of his work when he sort of arrived at this. He had I think what he had done is he masked off an area on the canvas and then he painted around it and then he pulled the tape off and he saw this zip. And so he then spent his career sort of developing that. Now, Barnett Newman talks a lot about sort of the sublime in painting. And his idea is that even though it's abstract, it's got to hold up to the art of the past. So that when you're responding to a painting like the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo, you're responding to sort of this sublime emotion, okay? And with Reinhardt said, I'm sorry, what Newman says is that the same emotion needs to happen when you're looking at an abstract painting, okay? Now you can agree or disagree whether or not this achieves that, okay? But he certainly felt like, he had achieved it. One of the things that the good thing about Newman is that he was a great theorist. And so he did talk a lot about, what was going on in abstract painting and what abstraction should be about. And he was one of the major theorists of abstract expressionism. But, and a lot of people came to painting because of him. So I had an instructor, a painter named Jeremy Gilbert Rolfe, who was my instructor at Art Center. And he talked about, because when he asked me, well, who is it that you got, why did you want to become an artist? And I told him what I told you guys. It was Mark Rothko that made me want to be an artist. And he said, yeah, that's what most artists will cite is either Rothko or Newman. Okay. And so for him, it was Barnett Newman that made him want to become a painter. And when you see his work, you can kind of see that. I've met a lot of people who said Rothko was the artist that made them want to be an artist, but I haven't met many people who said Newman. So I might disagree a little bit with my teacher. But what he responded to in Newman, because Mr. Gilbert Rolfe was English and living in England, and he saw these paintings and he felt like in America there must be the same feeling that I think that de Kooning had. America must have this vast, immense space for them to make paintings like this. So I can't make paintings like this in England, so I have to go to America. And so he did. And he actually did spend some time with Newman and, sort of certainly studied under him for a while and then developed his own sort of theoretical sort of structure for what he was doing and what a lot of postmodern people were doing. So he was, so Jeremy was kind of important. He was important for my development, but he was important for a lot of people that went through Art Center at a particular period in time. And this is Robert Motherwell. Robert Motherwell was one of the first generation abstract expressionists. He was one of those people that that the surrealists would kind of make fun of because, he would, he was educated and tried to, talk to them in French. And of course, French people love that when Americans are speaking to, to them in French because they will mock your grammar and things like that. But anyway, I don't want to sound like I don't like the French. I love the French. But anyway, so Motherwell, what his big development was this sort of this motif that you will see in a lot of his paintings. It's this very similar composition. It's called the Elegy for the Spanish Republic, and it is its genesis was from a small gouache, like 5 inches by 5 inches, little thing that he had done, abstract gouache drawing, painting. But it's so resonated with him that he spent the rest of his career painting, if not hundreds, certainly close to it, okay, of versions of this. So LA County, if LA County ever opens again, and has a space that they can display their permanent collection again, they have one of the Elegy paintings in their collection. You can see a lot of them. There's a lot of different versions of them. Generally, they're this coloration. So you see the black and the white and the ochre. That's generally what they are, but not always. Sometimes they're in oil. This one looks like it's oil. Sometimes they're in acrylic because he starts to use acrylic, which up until now, we haven't seen any acrylic painting yet because acrylic hasn't been invented. But you are going to start to see that with some of these abstract expressionist painters. So definitely, for me, there was a show when I was first starting out. I was an undergrad at Cal State Northridge, and there was a retrospective at LA County of Motherwell. So it was the first large survey I'd seen of an abstract painter. So he was important to me. And so maybe more important to me than he is to others. A lot of people look at him as being sort of a minor abstract expressionist. But, you know, I think that the core of the abstract expressionists are the people that I'm showing you. There are a lot more of them, but certainly these people are sort of setting the boundaries for the territory of abstraction, which is why, even though it's a historical style, I have, you know, my painting class, for example, both 31 and 32, making abstract paintings in sort of the abstract expressionist style so that they can kind of come to terms with what it takes to construct a painting without depending on imagery, okay? And it's something that you're gonna have to come to terms with in the very last work that we do. And then this is an example of Lee Krasner's work. Once, you know, she's living with Pollock, and then, you know, he starts drinking again. He's, you know, he's starting to resent her as being sort of a boss, and, you know, that kind of thing. And their marriage kind of starts to fall apart. And then once that happens, then she is able to sort of unentangle herself from all his stuff and start concentrating on her own work. And this is a really nice Krasner, certainly developing that all over compositional style, very painterly. LA County has one in their collection, but it's not like this. So I look at this as being sort of the classic sort of Krasner style. And then this is what's considered a second generation abstract expressionist painter. This is Joan Mitchell. And Joan Mitchell is taking the vocabulary of de Kooning and maybe Krasner and those people, and, you know, just sort of using that as a framework. You can certainly see the painterly quality of it and the drippiness of it. I never really thought too much about her work, and then later, I would say, going on maybe 8 years ago, maybe, there was right around the time she died, there was a show of hers at Gagosian, and Gagosian's space in Beverly Hills is a really nice space, and it has the skylights and things. It's a really great place to see work. And I saw a bunch of her later paintings, and in that light, and they were awesome. And so I became a fan at that point. The thing that were interesting, the things that were interesting about her work is she starts to use symmetry in her painting, even though it's very painterly. And they have a very pastoral, sort of almost landscapey feel to them without being, you know, kitschy looking like landscapes, because they don't. I mean, they're not really landscapes, but they have that sort of, you have that feeling of, you know, atmosphere that you would have if you were actually in a landscape, which I thought was kind of interesting. So certainly a very masterful painter. And then this this is something completely different. So this in the 50s in England, we have something that is more, there's a British figurative school. And this artist is Francis Bacon. And Bacon was kind of important for me when I was first starting, when I was an undergrad, and I was trying to think about, what are the possibilities of painting and drawing and representation, and Bacon spoke to me, probably because it's so sort of tortured, right? And so, like, you're in college and you're in your 20s, and that sort of angsty, I don't know, angry kind of way of looking at things appeals to young men. So I think that was one of the things that I responded to. And so I was still living at home at that time. So I was going to school. That's one of the great things about Cal State Northridge is it's a commuter school, right? So you can live at home, and then, you just drive to school and take your classes. You don't have to live on campus. Some people do now, but it wasn't common then. And so I rigged up a little studio for myself in the garage, and was making paintings for my, my painting classes, or sort of Bacon-esque paintings, a lot, with faces like that. And I remember my it's in the garage, so my dad would park in the garage, right? So you'd have to see these things every day, and I remember him hating them, and so for me, that was, well, I must be doing something right then if my dad hates them. So so that was sort of a developmental thing for me. What, again, we talk about is when the formal choices, right? How you are, the choices you're making in paint handling and in drawing, okay? How those affect your interpretation of the work. So this is a copy of a painting of a Pope by Velázquez, okay? So what I always say to my students is, well, what do you think Bacon's attitude is toward the Catholic Church based on this painting? Do you think he's like a devout Catholic, or do you think that maybe he is anti-Catholic? I don't know what he was, but I would assume that it certainly doesn't look like a positive representation of the Pope. It looks sort of a horrific, right, representation of the Pope, like a nightmarish screaming Pope, right? So I would assume that he was not, his relationship with the church, even though he's Irish, I think he was born in Ireland, and likely Catholic. I'm sure he's got a very mixed feelings, let's say, mixed feelings about the church. He himself was gay, and at a time when that was not something that was spoken about so much. And he was also into sadomasochism, and that, when you look at his paintings, you might go, oh, okay, well, I kind of get that. They all have this sort of, tortured look about them. And he does fragment figures oftentimes, not so much in this, but he cuts figures up in a way like, say, Picasso would do. And then this is another British figurative painter, recently died. This is Lucian Freud. And Lucian Freud actually was Sigmund Freud's grandson, and was a painter in England. And the thing about Freud's later work, he starts off doing sort of vaguely surrealist looking painting. And then when he's doing these kinds of things in the, by about the 80s, till his death in the 2000s, he's making these really thick, encrusted surfaces, right? And these very fleshy nudes. And oftentimes he's got this very high eye level looking down on them. So it's almost in a predatory way. And he builds these things up, and so when you see them in person, they're even, I mean, you can tell that is layer after layer after layer of very thick paint, okay? And so he takes a great deal of time, which is to make these, which is why he paints from life. So That's why a lot of the times his models are sleeping or laying down, because to model for him is going to be a very difficult experience, something that's going to take place over time, and so you want to be comfortable. Okay, so the thing about the funny thing is he and Bacon were friends, and at one point they decided, hey, you know what would be cool? Why don't we do portraits of one another? So Bacon, will do a portrait of Freud, and Freud will do a portrait of Bacon. And so, for Bacon, you sit for Bacon for maybe a day, maybe 2 days, but Bacon had to sit for Freud for months, all right, for him to make his portrait. So anyway, if this be in the same way that, like I talked about Guston, in the 90s, in the aughts, a lot of people, were talking about Freud, and you can see his influence on somebody like Jenny Saville, who is, who right now, if you care about such things, Jenny Saville has the record for a woman artist for selling her work for a certain amount. So she has the highest price for a female artist in history. Okay, so when you look at her work, which is good in its own right, it isn't necessarily completely beholden to Freud, but you can see and I'm pretty sure she's British, and I'm not 100% sure whether or not she studied with him, but you can see the influence of Freud in her work. And then this is Louise Bourgeois, and she is oftentimes lumped into the Surrealist school, but she's really sort of outside of Surrealism, because she was working sort of after Surrealism kind of happened. And the great thing about her is that she does all kinds of media. So she does something like this, which is a sculpture, and she does drawing, and she does big installations, and they all are like these sort of creepy psychosexual objects that you can't quite define but look familiar in some way. So this object looks like so sort of like the Venus of Willendorf, kind of a totemic type fetish figure, right? But it also has aspects of both the feminine, right, and the masculine, which a lot of her work has this sort of hybridization of feminine and masculine. And so she has, I believe she was abused and had some issues to work through with that, and so she worked those things out through her artwork. Her artwork was utilized in a film by Pedro Almodovar. I think it's called The Skin I Live In or something like that, which is kind of a modern day Frankenstein transgender horror film. So her work figures heavily into that. It's not a bad movie, so you can't go wrong seeing a film by Pedro Almodovar. So check it out. But Antonio Banderas is in it. But you'll see a lot of her work being used in that movie. And then here is somebody who is important for abstraction, but important also for Santa Monica, because this is part of the Ocean Park series. So this is Richard Diebenkorn, and Richard Diebenkorn starts out as a Bay Area figurative painter in the 50s, comes down to LA, gets a studio on Ocean Park. In a way similar to Motherwell, he's sitting in his studio and he's doing this little gouache watercolor sketch. And it's representational, but it's like the tops of, the house across the street and maybe a palm tree or something and telephone line or something like that. And it's cropped in such a way that it becomes almost abstract, right? And so then he starts to develop that. He was at the same time teaching at UCLA. And the thing that's interesting or great about Diebenkorn is this sense of color and light that we who have spent time in Santa Monica, I think, will recognize. And so for me, there are times when I'm driving, down the street, maybe even on Ocean Park, where I will all of a sudden be struck by this sort of Diebenkorn sense of light, that is obviously the Santa Monica type of light, the light that you get when you're near the ocean, right? Particularly, in Southern California. So he's really great at getting that across. There was a once in a lifetime show at the Orange County Museum of Art showing Diebenkorn's work and all the Ocean Park stuff. And it was really a great show to see. And LA County's got a couple of these. And then this is also an artist who spent some time in Santa Monica and had a studio here. And this is Sam Francis. And so Sam Francis is making, abstract paintings. He generally has this primary color scheme, so the triadic color scheme. You can see, and it's unusual that it be there, but at the Norton Simon Museum of Art, and the reason it's unusual is because the Norton Simon Museum of Art, the work that they collect tends to end at modernism, and this is after modernism, but they do own one of these, and LA County owns one of these. And I saw a lecture about him from one of his, I think it was an assistant. She worked for him for a while. And she was talking about the fact that he did stain painting before the person who's credited for inventing stain painting. And so it's kind of, he doesn't really get the credit for that. And the other thing that Sam Francis was sort of detrimental to his career was that he didn't spend any real amount of time in New York. So he was painting when abstract expressionism is going on, and it's going on hot and heavy in New York. He visits New York on his way to France, right? And so he goes off to France, and France is dead at this point. And so he was one of the more important painters in France, but being an important painter in France is I don't know, is like being the most important bronking buck rider in Kosovo or something. It's not where you go to do that. So it was kind of a bad career move for him. And then he also spent time in Japan. So he never really wanted to for I don't know what reason, maybe he felt intimidated, but he didn't ever spend a lot of time where this type of work was being celebrated. So it did impact his career, and he probably would be better, more, he's well known here in LA, but he'd be more well known throughout the world, I think, had he spent more time in New York. And this is the artist that gets credited with inventing this technique of stain painting. So this is Helen Frankenthaler. And Helen Frankenthaler, so again, we have to give it to her. So like, even though Sam Francis allegedly did the stain thing first, Helen Frankenthaler gets credit for it. How many times does that happen? That a woman gets credit for something that a man did? Never. It's always the other way around, right? That a woman does something and then the man takes credit for it. So we'll have to give it to her. But the thing that's important for the development of Western painting is where she's looking at, Jackson Pollock, and she's figuring out, well, how can I do that, but have it be something that just isn't like a homage to Pollock, right? So I don't want to imitate him. And so what she does is she takes the cotton duck canvas and lays it out on the floor like Pollock, and she pours the paint like Pollock did. But her paint is really, really thin. At this point, she's using oil paint. You can tell that because there's this, oil that's being seeping out of the paint onto the canvas. But she's letting that, she's pouring the paint onto the surface, and the canvas is unprimed and it soaks into the canvas. And in that way, you eliminate, that sort of the painterly incidence, the surface variation that you see that seemed to be so important for abstract expressionists, and it points abstraction into a new direction. And that new direction is going to be color field. So color field painting is what's going to happen after abstract expressionism. Now, color field was championed by Clement Greenberg as the next step in painting. He spent some time, they were romantically involved at one point, Helen Frankenthaler and Clement Greenberg. And then Clement Greenberg actually brought some other artists that he had seen in Washington, D.C., who were doing things that he thought they would relate to what she was doing. And he sort of created this school of color field. And so then he started talking about how color field was going to be the next big thing in painting. And at this point in time, enough artists were sick of Clement Greenberg, and they just said, well, I beg to differ. I don't think it is going to be the next important thing. And it turned out not to be, okay? But it was a development in abstraction, and it was an important time. This is Jules Olitski. So Olitski is one of those people that is, the reason you can see probably why they call it color field, because you've got this big field, this big expanse of color, and you go from one color to, slowly transition from this sort of chartreuse maybe to sort of fuchsia, right? So that in the progressions in between there. And generally these large fields, and he has usually some little thing at the bottom like that. So Olitski was part of that color field movement, as was this artist, Morris Louis, who these things are really, really big. And so what he would do is he'd take big buckets of paint and pour them so that they would fall down like that. And sometimes they would mix together, and sometimes he would keep them separate. LA County's got a great one of these. But this is what is going to supplant abstract expressionism. And it's kind of interesting in the development of art. And we talked a little bit about this artist and his significance. This is Jasper Johns, and Jasper Johns is looking at abstract expressionism, as you can see, because he's got these, very painterly ways of making marks. But you can also see that what he's using as a way of composing is an arbitrary system of 0 through 9. And the scale of the painting is based on the scale of these individual units that are going to contain the numbers, right? 0 through 9. And the system then, goes from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 down and across as well, right? And so it's again, an arbitrary system that he's using to make a composition. Now, the reason he's doing this is because he felt like this is the only way that you can get away from composition. Because even somebody like Frankenthaler or Pollock or Klein, all those abstract expressionists that were trying to do, sort of this radical new type of painting, were still following the rules of balance and unity and variety and things like that of Western painting. Okay, so all those design principles and elements that were evident in those were evident in the supposedly new type of painting. So Johns figures the only way you can eliminate composition is to base it off of something like pattern or something that that already exists. Okay, so numbers or letters. He does one of the alphabet, maps of the United States, those kinds of things. So that was his way of getting away from composition. Now, we talked about with Johns, one of the other significant things, it's not so evident in this, but he is going to start using actual space. And actual space is something that the minimalist artists that come after him are going to jump on. And then taking imagery from popular culture, things that are, images already to start with, and then representing them. That's something that the pop artists are going to take from. So what Jasper Johns is usually considered a proto-pop artist, the beginnings of pop art, and that's sort of his niche. He's still alive for now, but he's getting up there in age. And so for a long time, he had the record for the the highest price at auction for a living artist. But I don't know if he still has that anymore. But certainly his work has been, important, but also popular. He just had a retrospective at the Broad not too long ago. And then this artist is somebody, also a proto-pop artist, somebody who was working with Johns. They had a relationship at a point in time. They lived together, and they had studio together. And this is called Rebus, and it's Robert Rauschenberg. And so with Rauschenberg, you can kind of see, oh, well, definitely representing these images from popular culture, funny pages, and pictures and posters and things, photographs, collaging those onto the canvas surface. You can see how that could be sort of the beginnings then of pop art, but still holding on to the painterly mark, right? Now, the interesting thing about pop art is it's I believe it's one of the first decidedly queer art movements, in that you've got two artists here that are sort of laying the foundations for pop art, that are gay, and the idea that they are sort of expressing, both of them, is that they are making a homage to the abstract expressionist aesthetic, while they are also making fun of it a little bit, okay? That's the theory of camp. And camp is a very queer idea. The idea that you can make a homage to something and make fun of it at the same time is a very gay idea. And it didn't really exist in straight culture. So imagine, say, a drag show, where men are dressing as women, that they are paying homage to femininity, but also making a parody of it at the same time, a very queer sort of idea. So it's hugely important to the development of pop art. Not that all the pop artists were gay, but a lot of them were. The other thing that was interesting about pop art was that it developed in 3 different cities simultaneously, without the artists knowing each other or knowing what one another were doing. It's almost as if it was in the ether. So it made sense that it would develop in New York, because you had, the New York school, and they were sort of reacting against the New York school. If you were a New York school painter, an abstract expressionist painter, you had to be a man, and not just a man, but you had to be a macho, macho kind of man. And if you happened to be a woman, like Joan Mitchell, and you wanted to be part of that group, you had to behave as if you were a man. Okay, so you couldn't be overtly feminine and sensitive, right? If you were going to be taken seriously as an abstract expressionist. With gay men, because a lot of the, to be an artist in the 50s, a lot of people assumed you were gay anyway. So these they used to call the New York school the macho painters. So these macho painters, people would say, were compensating for this idea. So when somebody was overtly gay, they looked at that as being threatening, and they didn't really want them to be to associate with them. So there was a certain outsiderness that happened with Johns and Rauschenberg, and then the pop artists, where they weren't going to get to be part of that abstract expressionist club. So then that means they would have to start their own club. And that's what happens with pop art painting. So I mentioned that it happens in New York, and it happens in London, and it happens in LA, all three cities at the same time. And these artists don't know each other, and pop art is beginning. So this is not pop art. And if you had to locate this in the history of painting, you might guess that it is abstract expressionism. But this is Cy Twombly, and Cy Twombly was actually educated at the same place that Robert Rauschenberg was. They had both gone to this place called Black Mountain School. It was in, I think, North Dakota, and that school was kind of a forerunner to a place like Cal Arts, where you had it was multidisciplinary. And you had, they hired a bunch of artists to teach there, like fine artists from New York. So they brought them in. So de Kooning taught there, and Albers taught there, and people like that. And so European artists. And so you had this group of artists. They all had to live there because it was out in the middle of nowhere. So you had this great cross-pollination, and you had these artists working with students in, developing. This was probably a criticism of Cal Arts as well. You had sort of a commingling of students, where the structure of teacher to student was sort of broken down, and cross-pollination was happening in every way you can imagine, not just multidisciplinary, but also actual pollination. But anyway, so the fertilization. So the idea going on there was sort of a revolutionary way of looking at art training. Before, you sort of had this atelier sort of model. The way that a French artist would have learned to be an artist was that, you would go to a school that a French master was sort of the main teacher, in. And and this sort of exploded that. And so not only did you had masters there, but you had a bunch of them, and they all had different ideas and different biases, and they'd all, argue with each other about what it was right and what was not. And, it just created this very fertile ground for artists to develop. So Robert Rauschenberg, became an artist there probably. And so did this guy, Cy Twombly. So Cy Twombly, Robert Rauschenberg, and Jasper Johns were all part of some type of love triangle, allegedly. And I don't know how that worked out. I don't know the who was cheating on who or what. But anyway, so they probably were bouncing ideas off of each other. But if you look at how Twombly handles the surface, you can see how, in a way that's sort of different than abstract expressionists, because abstract expressionists are dealing with that sort of Hoffman-esque push-pull of space. And here, Twombly is dealing with a surface, and he's treating it as a surface. So all these marks look awfully close to what happens when you have a 3-year-old who gets a hold of some crayons or pencils and are left unsupervised, what they will do to a wall. It looks a lot like that, okay? And so you'll see a lot of the sort of scribbling he even has some paintings that are based on chalkboard and chalk kind of motif, so that the surface of the support is covered in chalkboard paint, and then he just scribbles on it with chalk. And so when you're dealing with that, then the space of the object itself becomes really important. So that's kind of how it gets lumped into this protopop movement. But also certainly it is abstract, and it does bear some relationship to abstract expressionists, right? The other great thing is I always like these sort of pinks and these fleshy colors that he's doing, and the mark making. For a lot of people, Twombly is a bridge too far. Like, they just look at this and they go, "Oh, this is ridiculous." And so a lot of times when students first see it, they really have a hard time with it. I love it personally. When you see them in good lighting situations, like recently, right around the time that he died, they had a couple of them. I believe it was at LA County Museum of Art, but in that Renzo Piano building, the one with the escalator, top floor with the skylights, awesome, looked beautiful in that space. And then this is pop proper. Okay, so this is Andy Warhol, and Andy Warhol doing these silk screen paintings. So not only is Andy Warhol taking images from popular culture, but he's reproducing them in the same way that you would reproduce, you know, these advertisements, right? So using silk screen printmaking methods, and yet presenting them as fine art. And this is James Rosenquist, and this is F111. James Rosenquist is somebody that is combining images. This is called F111, and the scale of the work is based on the actual scale. So it's the actual size of an F111 fighter jet. So here you just see the nose of the fighter jet, and then it goes back this way. And it can be seen all on one horizontal plane, or it can be seen like this in a room where they have to bend around the corner, and which is probably how it was originally seen. And so what Rosenquist did was Rosenquist starts off as a billboard artist. So he's painting these things like he would a billboard. And billboards used to be in New York, you know, in the 50s, used to be hand painted. And there are still people that do that. So when you see them from a distance, they look very photoreal, but when you see them up close, you can see that they're obviously painted. They're made to be seen from a distance. Billboards are made to be seen from a distance. And what he does that's interesting is that he takes these images that really have no relationship to one another, but when he presents them together, they do, okay? And you start to see the connections that you can make with these things, so that you have the F-111 fighter jet, but then you also have, Franco-American spaghetti that he's painted. And then in the context of the fighter jet or the mushroom cloud, right? You start to think, oh, okay, well then these can be, tendons or something, or, innards and blood. And so you start to make that type of connection. He'll take things, formally that resemble each other, like the mushroom cloud and the umbrella that are, close in form. And then this is a hair dryer, and the little girl in the hair dryer. The hair dryer looks very ominous, kind of like the cone of a fighter jet, right, or a bomb or something. And going on top of this poor little girl's head, you really start to see, even though she's happy, she's just getting her hair done. It has a very threatening feel to it. So this combining these images in this way is going to become really important to artists later. He's going to be an important influence, I think, on a photo conceptual artist who was really important in the development of Los Angeles art. That's John Baldessari. And John Baldessari was teaching at Cal Arts, and at Cal Arts, he was teaching people like David Salle, and David Salle would take sort of the strategies through Baldessari of Rosenquist in combining images. So the two of those guys were really important for the way art started to look in the 80s. And then this would be the LA version of pop art. So Rosenquist and Warhol were New York, even though Warhol's first show, by the way, the soup cans, his first gallery show, that was in Los Angeles. So this is Ed Ruscha, and Ed Ruscha is, this is the Standard Station, but he also has, Mocha has one in their collection, I think the can of Spam, which is kind of like the Campbell soup can, right? Ruscha is going to, still alive, going to do a lot, I think, more interesting things later in his career, but he's always interested in taking images from popular culture, and it could be things like advertisements or movies or things like that, and presenting those in a way where they're unfamiliar. And then this isn't technically a pop artist, but this is an artist that's coming to Los Angeles from England. And so he was aware of all the stuff that was going on in England at the time. I believe now, this is David Hockney. David Hockney now has the record for a living artist. And as far as a painting being sold at auction, it's also a painting at a swimming pool. This is the kinds of things that he was getting known for. The one that sold for a lot is more, I would say, more naturalistic in its representation. The thing that's great about this painting, and somebody picked this as their artwork that they were really impressed by in our little discussion at the start of the semester. But the thing that is great about this painting is that if you just take out like the palm trees and the grass and the chair, right? This is an abstract painting. I mean, the way that he's squared everything up. So when I talk about, trying to get the illusion of form in space, this is how you don't do it, right? If that was your goal, but that's not his goal. His goal, he was somebody very, very, very influenced by Matisse. And so he has a lot of paintings that are very Matisse-like, particularly in his later years. So, but here you can see this sort of combination of representation and abstraction where you could obviously recognize a very California type landscape, but making it seem like an abstract painting. And then this is the beginnings of minimalism. And so we are going to stop here for today. And hopefully, if you guys sat through this whole lecture in one go, good for you. I did it in one go, but if you had to pause and come back to it, that's certainly okay. The one good thing, the thing about slide lectures, not just giving them, but the thing about sitting through a slide lecture, my favorite classes, besides studio classes, were art history classes. I loved sitting in a classroom, having the instructor show images on the screen and talking about what was going on in them. I thought that was the greatest thing known to man, okay? And the fact that I was getting college credit for it, I felt like I was stealing, okay? But not everybody does, I found. And so the one advantage I have in doing my slide lecture this way is that I don't see anybody falling asleep, okay? Which they do. When you're in a dark room and you hear my voice going on and on, a lot of times people will doze off, okay? And so of course, when you're speaking into a group of people, seeing somebody fall asleep, kind of offensive to the speaker, I think, but obviously they can't help it. They wouldn't do it if they could help it, but I don't see that. So if you fell asleep on your computer, I don't care, okay? But I want you to go back to the point you fell asleep at and watch the rest of this. Right now, this slide lecture is not important to what you're doing so far. What you've done so far, like I said before, is representation of form and space in a very traditional way. But it is going to be important later. And it is going to be important for you when you're thinking about what it is that you are going to be making, when you have to confront making an artwork that doesn't look like what you are observing, okay? That is either completely non-representational or a stylization. And the funny thing is, some people are really good at representation, but then fall apart when it comes to abstraction. And some people might not be very good at representation, but are really good when they don't have to make something that looks like something else, okay? They're very good at arranging things, composition, things like that. And then there are people that are good at both things, okay? So the main thing that you need to understand is that we judge artwork, whether abstract or representational, by the same standards. So they're based on how you are using the design elements and principles, okay, formally. That's how we do it. And I've had conversations with people where they said, and I tell them I've taught classes that were, only abstraction, right? And I've had people, well, gee, how do you teach that? You can't teach that. Well, of course you can, okay? You can teach abstraction in the same way you teach anything else. But a lot of people have this very sort of misinformed idea that it's just like anything goes, and whatever the artist does, that's it, and that's obviously not true, because then there would be no good abstraction versus bad abstraction. All right. Now, some people think that's all bad, but obviously there's going to be a hierarchy, okay? And that happens through the development of your taste. And the development of your taste happens by your exposure to more and more artwork, okay? So that's why it's important that all students take art history, all art students, and not just any art history, but art history, I think in Santa Monica, we break it up into 3 sections. When I went to school, it was only 2. And then you can go on to the more specialized. So a history of contemporary artwork is a really important class, which is kind of what you've seen just now. And an understanding of that, okay? Hopefully when I get back to this, I'll remember to talk about, the way that artists are schooled now versus how they were schooled then, because this artist is a great example of that. Okay, but we are going to end the slideshow for today here. We'll pick this up at some point in time, and you will get to see the rest of it. Okay, so I hope you all digest this and are ready for the next big show.